It is the dead of winter in the year 500 BC, and you are standing on a frozen windswept plateau in the Altai Mountains of Central Asia. The air is so thin it feels like it's scraping your throat, and the silence of the high steppe is broken only by the rhythmic chanting of a dozen fur-clad figures. They are gathered around a small, low-slung tent made of thick felt and leather, the seams sealed tight against the biting wind. Inside that tent, the atmosphere is the opposite of the frozen world outside. It is sweltering, thick with a heavy, sweet, acrid cloud that stings your eyes and sticks to your clothes. You watch as a warrior, his skin covered in intricate blue tattoos of mythical griffins, leans over a bronze tripod filled with white-hot stones. He isn't cooking meat or heating the tent for warmth. Instead, he drops a handful of dried green flowers onto the stones, and as the smoke bellows up, he inhales deeply, closing his eyes as his grief for a fallen leader begins to dissolve into a strange rhythmic laughter. This is a funeral, but it looks like a celebration. Here is the paradox. These people are performing one of the most solemn rites of their culture, yet they are intentionally altering their consciousness to the point of euphoria. It's a scene that feels like it belongs in the 1960s, but it's happening 2.5 millennia ago. Why would a warrior culture, defined by its brutality and survival instincts, prioritize a plant that makes you forget your surroundings? The answer is that the story of humans and cannabis is far older, stranger, and more deeply embedded in our biology than almost anyone realizes. But before we dive into the ancient smoke, we have to deal with the modern fog, which, ironically, has obscured the truth about this plant for nearly a century. Most people today assume that smoking weed is a relatively new phenomenon, a counterculture invention that bubbled up in the jazz clubs of the 1920s or the hippie communes of the Summer of Love. We have been conditioned to see it as a modern vice, a recreational detour in the long march of human civilization. This is the great myth. If you look at the actual timeline of human history, the period where we haven't used cannabis is the actual anomaly. For nearly 99% of our history, this plant was not a forbidden drug. It was a fundamental pillar of human survival. It was our rope, our medicine, our clothing, and our bridge to the divine. We didn't just stumble upon it in a basement. We grew up with it. Scientists are now discovering that we might have been using this plant since before we even knew how to write, or bake bread, or build a city. The real mystery isn't when we started smoking. It's why we ever convinced ourselves that we hadn't been doing it all along. If we want to find the true origin of this relationship, we have to look past the myths and into the very soil where the first seeds took root to find the actual birth of the high. We have to travel back much further than any human city, back to a time when the world was a very different place. About 28 million years ago, long before the first human ancestors walked upright, a botanical miracle occurred on the high-altitude Tibetan plateau. This was the moment the cannabis plant officially diverged from its closest relative, the common hop. The plant used to flavor beer today. Dr. John McPartland, a researcher whose work appeared in the journal Vegetation History and Archaeobotany, used a sophisticated technique called fossil pollen analysis to track this evolution. He found that cannabis didn't start in the lush jungles or fertile valleys. It started in the harsh, UV-blasted environment of the mountains. This is a crucial detail, and one that most people overlook because it explains why the plant produces THC in the first place. The plant didn't create those psychoactive molecules to get humans high. Humans didn't exist yet. It created them as a form of biological sunscreen and an advanced chemical defense against high-altitude insects. The very thing that changes our brain chemistry was originally just a way for a weed to survive a brutal mountain winter. As the Earth moved through various ice ages, the cannabis steppe began to expand across Asia. By the time our ancestors finally arrived on the scene, the plant was already waiting for them like a biological treasure chest. Imagine being an early human wanderer and finding a plant that is essentially a toolkit in a single stem. You can strip the stalks to make the strongest fiber in nature, which is perfect for nets and bowstrings. You can eat the seeds, which are packed with more protein and essential fatty acids than almost any other wild grain. And eventually, you realize that if you throw the dried flowers onto a fire, something very strange happens to the way you perceive the world. This wasn't a sudden discovery, but a slow, multi-generational realization that this specific plant was different from all the others. It was a biological bribe that the plant offered us. If we protected it and spread its seeds, it would provide us with everything we needed to survive and a way to escape the harshness of reality. But even with this deep history, the question remains, When did we stop just using it for rope and start using it for the smoke? For a long time, archaeologists believed that the first intentional use of cannabis for its altering properties started with the birth of agriculture, but new evidence suggests we were sampling the plant long before we ever cleared a field. In 2008, a team of researchers led by Dr. Yang Yimin of the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences made a startling discovery at the Yonghai tombs in the Turpan Basin of western China. They opened a 700-year-old grave belonging to a man who appeared to be a high-ranking shaman. He was buried with a collection of high-status items: a leather basket, a wooden bowl, and a massive cache of 789 grams of dried cannabis flowers. What makes this finding credible, aside from the sheer volume, is that the flowers were entirely from female plants that had been carefully selected for their high THC content. The seeds and the leaves, the parts used for food or fiber, had been meticulously removed. This wasn't a farmer's stash for making rope, it was a specialist's stash for altering the mind. This shaman knew exactly which part of the plant held the power, and he had enough of it to stay high for a lifetime. But even this shaman was a latecomer to the party. To find the true patient zero of cannabis use, we have to look toward the islands of Japan. Archaeological excavations on the Oki Islands have uncovered cannabis seeds dating back to 8000 BC during the early Jomon period. These people weren't farmers in the traditional sense. They were complex hunter-gatherers who lived off the sea and the forest. The presence of these seeds suggests that cannabis was one of the very first plants humans ever brought under their control. In fact, there is a provocative theory in evolutionary biology called the hemp-first hypothesis, which was famously championed by the astronomer Carl Sagan. The idea is that humans didn't settle down to grow wheat or barley. We settled down specifically to grow hemp because it was so useful. In this version of history, we didn't follow civilization. It created it. We stopped wandering because we found a plant that was too valuable to leave behind, and we stayed in one place long enough to figure out how to unlock its deepest secrets. But as our relationship with the plant deepened, our methods for consuming it became much more sophisticated than just chewing on a leaf. The transition from eating or wearing the plant to actually inhaling its smoke was a technological leap that required a very specific set of circumstances. You can't just set a field of fresh cannabis on fire and expect to get high. The smoke dissipates too quickly in the open air. You need a way to concentrate the fumes, and you need to understand the chemistry of decarboxylation, even if you don't have a word for it. This brings us back to those laughing mourners in the Altai Mountains. The people I described at the beginning were the Scythians, a nomadic group of horse warriors who dominated the Eurasian steppe for centuries. They were the masters of the hotbox. We know this because the ancient Greek historian Herodotus actually saw them do it. He wrote about how they would build small teepee-like structures, crawl inside, and throw cannabis seeds and flowers onto red-hot stones. He noted that they would shout for joy as the vapor filled the tent. For centuries, historians thought Herodotus was exaggerating or making it up to make the barbarians look strange. But in the late 1940s, a Soviet archaeologist named Sergei Rudenko proved Herodotus right. Rudenko excavated a series of frozen tombs at a site called Pazyryk, high in the Altai. Because the tombs had been flooded and then flash frozen shortly after they were built, the organic material inside was perfectly preserved for over 2,000 years. Inside the tombs, Rudenko found exactly what Herodotus described: small leather tents, bronze cauldrons, and even the hot stones themselves, still covered in the charred, black residue of cannabis. This wasn't just a casual habit, it was a sophisticated ritual technology. The Scythians had figured out that by using stones to radiate heat, they could vaporize the active compounds without fully incinerating the plant material, creating a more potent and lung-friendly experience. It was essentially the world's first vaporizer. This ritual served a dual purpose. It bonded the warriors together through a shared, intense experience, and it likely helped them process the immense trauma of their violent lives. But the Scythians weren't the only ones using smoke to talk to the dead or the gods. As we move south into the ancient Near East, the evidence for ritual smoking becomes even more provocative, and for some, quite controversial. In 2020, researchers analyzed an 8th century BC altar found at a shrine in Tel Arad, Israel. This was a sanctuary located on the southern border of the Kingdom of Judah. When the team, led by archaeologist Aaron Ari, tested the dark residue on one of the limestone altars, they found something that shocked the academic world: a mixture of cannabis and animal dung. The dung was used as a fuel to keep the fire at a low, consistent temperature, the same vaporization trick the Scythians used, while the cannabis provided the smoke. This was a holy site, a place of worship dedicated to the God of the Bible. The presence of cannabis here suggests that for the ancient Israelites, the plant wasn't a drug in the modern sense. It was a sacred incense used to facilitate a connection with the divine. It was a tool for the priests to enter a state of mind where they could hear the voice of their creator. This discovery bridges the gap between the wild shamans of the north and the civilized religions of the Mediterranean. This brings us to a fascinating realization. The history of cannabis isn't a straight line from discovery to addiction. It's a story of different cultures finding different keys to the same lock. While the Scythians were hotboxing in tents and the Israelites were burning it on altars, the ancient Chinese were exploring its potential as a medical miracle. The Shennong Bencao Jing, often cited as the world's oldest pharmacopoeia, credits the legendary Emperor Shennong with discovering the healing properties of cannabis around 2700 BC. Whether or not Shennong was a real person, the text reflects a deep, ancient understanding of the plant. It was prescribed for absent-mindedness, constipation, and female weakness. By the 2nd century AD, the Chinese surgeon Hua Tuo was reportedly using a mixture of cannabis and wine called mafesin as the world's first general anesthetic. He would have his patients drink the concoction until they were numb and insensible, allowing him to perform complex abdominal surgeries that would have been impossible otherwise. It's a tragedy of history that his specific formula was lost after his execution, leaving the world without effective anesthesia for another 1,600 years. But why does this plant work on us at all? This is the point in the story where the investigation turns inward into the very chemistry of our brains. If humans started smoking weed thousands of years ago, it's only because our bodies were already waiting for it. In the late 1980s and early 90s, researchers like Dr. Alan Howlett and Dr. William Devane discovered something hidden in the human brain that changed everything we thought we knew about our biology: the endocannabinoid system, ECS. It turns out that every human being is born with a sprawling network of receptors, called CB1 and CB2, that are designed to interact with cannabinoid molecules. These receptors are more numerous than any other receptor system in the brain. But here's the kicker. We don't just have the receptors. We produce our own internal version of THC. The first one discovered was named anandamide, after the Sanskrit word for supreme bliss. This discovery reframes the entire history of human drug use. We aren't hacking our brains when we use cannabis. We are supplementing a system that already exists to regulate our mood, our appetite, our pain, and our memory. The plant just happens to produce a molecule that fits into our receptors like a spare key in a lock. This biological coincidence is why ancient humans, from the Altai Mountains to the temples of Judah, were so drawn to the plant. They didn't need a lab to tell them it worked. They felt it in their bones. The plant provided a shortcut to a state of balance that the body was already trying to achieve. And yet, this ancient biological partnership eventually ran into a wall of modern politics. If you look at the 12,000-year history of human cannabis interaction, the period of prohibition is a tiny, insignificant blip at the very end of the timeline. For 11,900 years, the plant was a tool of survival and spirituality. It's only in the last 100 years, less than 1% of the total story, that we decided it was a dangerous poison. This shift didn't happen because the science changed. It happened because the world changed. In the early 20th century, as industrialization took over, the versatile hemp plant became a threat to the burgeoning paper, plastic, and synthetic fiber industries. At the same time, political figures like Harry Anslinger in the United States realized they could use the fear of the weed as a tool to marginalize immigrant and minority communities. They took a plant with a dozen different names: hemp, cannabis, bang, daga, and rebranded it with a single foreign-sounding word: marijuana. They turned a 12,000-year-old companion into a terrifying new devil's root. But the Gore files and the propaganda of the 1930s couldn't erase the genetic memory of our species. The reason the war on drugs has been so spectacularly unsuccessful is that it is trying to fight millions of years of coevolution. You can't simply legislate away a biological receptor system that was developed on the Tibetan Plateau before the first mammoth was ever hunted. Even during the height of Prohibition, the plant never truly went away. It just went underground, waiting for the political winds to shift back toward the scientific reality. Today, as we see a global wave of re-legalization, We aren't actually doing anything new. We are simply returning to the normal state of human history. We are reclaiming a relationship that our ancestors, like the shaman in the Turpan Basin, would have considered as natural as breathing. So, when exactly did ancient humans start smoking weed? The truth is, there was likely no first moment, no single person who picked up a pipe and changed the world. Instead, it was a slow, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying dance between a species of primate and a species of weed. We followed the plant as it spread across the continents. We nurtured it as it evolved to be more potent, and in return, it gave us the fibers to sail the oceans and the visions to imagine the gods. We didn't just use cannabis. We were shaped by it. Our history, our religions, and even our brain chemistry are all woven together with the fibers of this single plant. To deny that history is to deny a part of what makes us human. Think back to that Scythian tent for a moment, which, honestly, is the only place where this story can truly end. Imagine the warrior sitting there, surrounded by the ghosts of his friends and the heavy, sweet scent of the Altai Mountains. He isn't worried about legal status or tax revenue or political optics. He is simply seeking a moment of peace in a brutal world. He is using a tool that his ancestors used for 100 generations before him, and as he exhales that long, thick cloud of smoke, he is connected to a lineage that stretches back to the very dawn of our kind. The story of cannabis is the story of us. It is a reminder that we are not separate from the natural world, but deeply, biologically intertwined with it. We have spent the last century trying to pretend that we are above the primitive rituals of the past, but the receptors in our brains tell a different story. They are silent witnesses to a partnership that began in the dirt and the smoke of the ancient world. And as we move forward into a new era of understanding, we aren't discovering something new. We are finally remembering who we have always been. Which, let's be honest, is a much more interesting story than any Reefer Madness movie could ever tell. I want to thank you for sticking through this long-form deep dive. This is a topic that is often buried in slogans and stereotypes, but the real history is far more fascinating. If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient past, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep the lights on so we can continue digging into the mysteries that history tried to forget. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. After seeing the archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Arad and the Yonghai tombs, do you think our modern perspective on this plant is finally catching up to the wisdom of the ancients, or are we still just scratching the surface of what this biological toolkit can do? Let me know in the comments below. Now, return one last time to that frozen plateau in the year 500 BC. Look at the edge of the leather tent, where a single, thin wisp of smoke escapes through a gap in the heavy felt. That smoke is more than just a byproduct of a fire. It is a physical bridge between the physical world and the world of the mind. That specific, acrid scent, the smell of charred green flowers and hot mountain stone, is the same scent that filled the temples of Judah and the surgeries of ancient China. It is a smell that has drifted through the halls of human history for 12,000 years, surviving every war, every empire, and every attempt to stamp it out. We didn't just start smoking weed in the 20th century. We have been huddling together in the dark, seeking that same supreme bliss. Since the very first time we realized that some plants do more than just fill our stomachs. The wisp of smoke fades into the cold mountain air, but the receptors in your brain are still there, waiting for the next spark. We have always been the people of the plant, and no law, no border, and no century of silence can ever truly change what is written in our very cells. That is the chilling, definitive truth of our history. We didn't find the high found us, and it never intended to let go.